Last time we discussed some members of the phylum Platyhelminthes, the flatworms, and I wanted to continue that discussion today. So we previously discussed members of the class Turbularia, which are the free-living flatworms. We also discussed class Cestoda, which are the parasitic tapeworms. And so I'd like to finish up the Platyhelminthes talking about a third class, which is the class Trematoda. And the trematodes are known as the flukes. And the flukes mostly are intestinal parasites. There are two subgroups to the flukes. We're just going to consider the one that has two suckers. They generally have an oral sucker and what's known as a ventral sucker. And so they'll hold on to the intestinal lining typically with the ventral sucker and then feed with the oral sucker. And just as with the tapeworms, there are a variety of different types of flukes. And I would say probably most animals, most vertebrates in the ecosystem at least, are infected either with the definitive host or some intermediate host. And just as with the tapeworms, again, the definitive host would be the host that has the sexually mature worms, and intermediate host would have some larval stage. And so there are both direct life cycles and also indirect life cycles that work through intermediate hosts. All right, so we've discussed in members of the infrakingdom Acela, again, members of the Platyhelminthes were in that infrakingdom. So I next want to move into another infrakingdom, which is the infrakingdom Protostomia. And so members of the Protostomia and characteristics of the Protostomia would be, these would be animals where the mouth forms from the blastopore, and that's the blastopore in that gastrulous stage of embryonic development. So again, remember in gastrulation, there's an indentation, beginning of the gut formation. And that first opening is the blastopore, and that will eventually form the mouth in the digestive tract. So they, again, will have an open digestive tract in which there's a tube. The first opening will be the mouth. And that's really what protostomia means. First opening is the mouth. Again, they have an open digestive tract. They are triploblastic, meaning they have all three of the embryonic tissues. And members of the Protostomia will have a body cavity, and they'll either be a pseudocoelomate or animal or a eucoelomate animal. Now, the first phylum I want to discuss within the Protostomia then would be the phylum Nematoda. And the Nematoda is one of the most abundant animals on Earth, and also in terms of diversity of species, also a tremendous diversity within this group as well. So their common name are roundworms. They are pseudocoelomic, open digestive tract. Most of them also have separate sexes. And so here's an example of a typical roundworm. This is an electron micrograph. And as we look at the Nematoda, again, they're really abundant. So we find them both free-living and parasitic forms. And so, again, free-living from pole to pole, basically. You'll find them from the Arctic to Antarctic. We'll find them in terrestrial ecosystems living in the soil. You'll find them in marine ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, virtually everywhere. And then a variety of different parasites of both animals and plants even. So they, again, just have filled virtually every niche you can imagine. Now, and we're going to focus on, again, some of these parasitic examples from the ecosystem. And as I've mentioned before, when we were talking about some of those flatworms, almost all, virtually all of the vertebrates in the ecosystem will be carrying either, act as either definitive hosts or intermediate hosts for nematodes potentially as well. So one of the nematodes that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem causes something called trichinosis. It's caused by the trichinella worm. These are intestinal worms, and the adults actually bear larvae instead of eggs. The larvae penetrate the intestinal lining of that host, travel through the bloodstream, and the larvae actually insist in the muscles of the same host. So the definitive host actually serves as the intermediate host. And so this diagram is showing us the encysted larval worms in the muscle of some animal. And so most mammals potentially can carry trichinella. Here's another slide again where this is muscle tissue. Here's the encysted larva. And again, this is the larva within the cyst. So the next host picks this up by consuming the flesh of the infected host. And so as this cyst passes through the intestinal tract, it will be softened. The worm breaks out of that in the intestine of the next host and then produces larvae that will move into the muscle tissue of that host. So again, if I was infected with a trichinella worm, the only way it could go to the next host would be that something would have to eat me and consume my muscle, and then the larval worms would be in that muscle. So again, this is something we see in virtually all mammals, potentially. Humans get exposed to it mostly through pork. And in the Yellowstone ecosystem, a lot of the carnivorous animals, or at least some of the carnivorous animals, potentially carry trichinella. We do find it in bears, for example, and bears probably initially picked this up by when they used to feed in the dumps, probably eating pork in the dumps. And I'm not sure what the incidence is today. It used to be pretty common. In fact, it was very common when bears were feeding in the dumps. But when they closed the dumps back in the 1970s, bears have turned to more natural sources of food, and so the incidence is nearly not what it was back in the 70s, but it's certainly still a part of the population there. Another worm that you see again that was probably originally picked up from feeding in dumps and so on is Ascaris. Ascaris is a very, very large intestinal nematode, and just to have you take a look at this, these are some preserved Ascaris worms. But this is one of the largest nematodes that you'll find, and again, just really large worms. So, again, I'll put my finger here. This is a preserved worm, but anyway, they can be 10, 11, 12 inches in size. And as you can imagine, that would be pretty uncomfortable if you had something like that crawling around in your intestinal tract. They potentially, if you have really large infestations, they can block the intestines. You can get rupturing of the intestines. So again, bears typically can carry Ascaris. Other carnivores will typically pick up Ascaris, but Ascaris doesn't really have an intermediate host. Basically, what happens is the worms are found in the intestine, eggs go out in the feces, and then they're ingested by the next host. Another intestinal parasitic nematode that we find in the ecosystem is hookworm. And hookworm is a little different in that it has some tooth-like structures associated with its mouth parts, and so it will attach to the intestinal lining and suck body fluids from on the inside. And so I'm not sure how well those are showing up, but again, members of this group have these little tooth-like structures. They're also a little unusual in that, and you can see it a little bit here, in that they also bear live larvae instead of laying eggs. So again, fairly common in the ecosystem. Again, bears, some other carnivores typically are carrying hookworms. Pinworms are also small intestinal worms. Usually not really problematic, just more of an irritant, really, unless you get, or an animal gets huge infestations. But again, that's one that we find in the ecosystem. And this is one that humans can carry. Most mammals, again, can carry these nematode worms, and we pass them among one another. Lungworms, common in a lot of different animals, including birds, and so these would be nematodes that actually get into the lungs. Eggs or larvae actually are produced in the lungs. Sputum is coughed up, swallowed down into the intestine, and then the larvae or eggs go out in the feces. And they can be directly consumed by another host. So again, this is not uncommon in mammals, also not uncommon in birds, and so the next host would pick these up. Also, earthworms sometimes will ingest the larvae or the eggs, and they can serve as an intermediate host here. And that's also true of something called a gapeworm. A gapeworm is another nematode worm that we find mostly in birds, and they get in the trachea, in the air passageway, and have a similar kind of life cycle to many of the lungworms. All right, so another parasitic worm or phylum of parasitic worms are the Acanthocephala. And their common name are the spiny-headed worms. And so they have some features in common with nematodes, but what distinguishes them is that they do have this evertable proboscis that has these spines on it, and they embed that in the intestinal lining and attach the intestinal lining that way. And you can imagine that would be irritating if you had lots of these in your intestine. So again, quite a few animals can be infected by acanthocephalans, including mammals, birds, amphibians, and fish, particularly the trout, but almost any fish can be infected with acanthocephalans. Now, moving away from some of these parasitic worms to some other types of protostomates that we find in the ecosystem. Another phylum would be the Rotifera, and the rotifers are small aquatic animals. They are pseudocoelomic, as these other animals that we've talked about to this point, the nematodes and the acanthocephalans both are. And rotifers are just small animals we find in aquatic ecosystems. They have some kind of rotating bands of cilia. They can either attach to a structure and then filter feed, or they can actually swim with these cilia and capture small organisms or organic material in the water. And they're very low in the food chain, so they can potentially be small predators, but again, they're more opportunistic feeders. And then, so they feed on algae, small protozoa, and so on. And then larger organisms feed on them. Which brings us to another group, an abundant group in the ecosystem, which is the phylum Arthropoda. The name Arthropoda is telling us that they are the joint-footed animals. And they have a jointed chitinous exoskeleton. That's the key feature of the group. And this is the first group that we'll discuss that really is eucoelomic, has a true coelom, and that you may recall that means that they have muscle or connective tissue lining the intestinal tract and the body wall, and then a body cavity between that. So the arthropods among animals are by far the most successful animal in terms of numbers of species, in terms of just sheer numbers of animals. Arthropods are the winners in that game, whatever that game happens to be. Now we're going to be considering not all arthropods. We're going to focus our attention on some of the groups that we find in the ecosystem. And so the first subphylum I want to consider within the phylum Arthropoda is the subphylum Cheliceraata. So chelicerates, characteristics of chelicerates is that they have the first two pairs of what we call post-oral appendages, appendages behind the mouth. The first pair of appendages are known as chelicerae. The second pair of post-oral appendages are pedipalps. And the chelicerae and the pedipalps will be adapted for something other than walking. So they might be pincers, they might be fangs, they might have some function other than just for walking from place to place. And we'll talk about some examples of chelicerates in just a second. They generally have two body regions, the so-called cephalothorax, which would be the head and the chest more or less fused together, and then an abdomen of some type. And then the chelicerates also lack antennae and generally have 4 pairs of walking legs. So if we look at some examples of chelicerates from the ecosystem, one of the classes of chelicerates are the arachnids, and the arachnids are the spiders. And within the arachnida include spiders and ticks and mites, which we'll also be considering here. So within the arachnida, one order that we'll consider here are the Arani, which are the true spiders. And so the true spiders, as you can see, have an abdomen. We have our cephalothorax, and these are the pedipalps, and the chelicerae are actually the fangs of the spider. And we can see here, we also see the 4 walking legs, which is characteristic of the group. Also, when you're trying to distinguish whether it is a spider, spiders generally produce webs too. That's another thing to look for. Okay, another order of the arachnids would be the order Acari. And in the Yellowstone ecosystem, examples of the Acari will be mites and ticks. So mites are problematic for a lot of animals in that they can be parasitic in some cases and irritating. We have some that are harmless to us, but there are some that are problematic. In the Yellowstone ecosystem in particular, the sarcoptic mange is actually caused by a species of mite. And this is a dust mite, and here's an example of a sarcoptic mite. So anyway, mange is an irritation of the hair follicles by mites, and the hair will actually fall out. And so this is a problem right now for wolves in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So it kind of cycles. We'll have periods where mange is more problematic than others. But the problem is that these mites get into the hair follicles, irritate the hairs, hairs fall out, and then they're not able to survive the winter. They're going to freeze to death in the winter. Another example of an Acari would be ticks. And the main tick that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem is the wood tick. And particularly early in the summer and the spring is when I most typically see ticks, but certainly if you're hiking an ecosystem, you always want to be checking for ticks after your hike. Ticks do have a mouth part that they'll embed into your skin. You'll see that it's actually serrated. And anyway, they're blood feeders, obviously, so they're ectoparasites feeding on blood. So when you do get ticks, you want to get them off as quickly as possible. The best way to get them off is to just grasp right at the base of the head and pull straight out. And that's really your best approach to ticks. Fortunately, the ticks in the Yellowstone ecosystem don't carry a lot of disease. In other parts of the country, you really would have to worry significantly about Lyme disease. The incidence of Lyme disease in Wyoming and Montana is pretty low. And I'll try to talk about the reason for that later. One disease that is probably the most common in that area, though, is tularemia, which is called rabbit fever. And it's one I had not thought to mention previously when we talked about bacteria, but this is caused by a gram-negative bacterium, and that is carried by ticks in the Yellowstone ecosystem. It usually causes kind of a flu-like disease, but it can be much more serious than that. So, that's the thing about ticks. You just don't want to get bitten by ticks. So be sure you're using bug spray. Be sure that you have you're checking regularly, especially early in the season when there's a lot of vegetation over the trails. Now, our last order within the Arachnida is the order Opiliones. And the Opiliones are the daddy longlegs. And so a lot of people confuse what's known as a cobweb spider with daddy longlegs. So the Opiliones have very long legs, but they don't produce webs. So that's one thing to look for. They have kind of a button-like body, and they're generally terrestrial. We're going to find them on the ground. So, certainly that would be something that some people confuse with the cobweb spider, but the cobweb spider produces webs. So daddy longlegs do not. Okay, the other subphylum, or another subphylum within the Arthropoda, again, very large subphylum, would be the subphylum Crustacea, the crustaceans. And characteristics of the crustaceans is that they, again, generally have two body regions, the cephalothorax and abdomen. They generally have what we consider to be biramous appendages. So if you look at where the appendages attach to the thorax or potentially the abdomen, there's usually two parts to that appendage. Maybe it's a walking leg or maybe it's used for swimming, but there'll be kind of another branch to that. So that's typical of crustacean appendages, being biramous, two-branched. And then they'll generally have two pairs of antennae and then 4 or more pairs of walking legs. So examples of crustaceans that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, one would be the class Copepoda. So copepods are pretty ubiquitous around the world in virtually every marine or aquatic ecosystem. And this is a slide of a copepod. Now in a living copepod, a couple things you look for is that if you look at the long axis of the body, in a living copepod, typically the antennae are carried perpendicular to the long axis. So this would be more or less the posture of a living arthropod. And then also if it's a female, she'll have paired egg sacs at the base of the abdomen. And that's another thing to look for. So copepods, again, we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem in our aquatic environments. They're small predators for the most part, so they're low in the food chain, although they may be feeding on microscopic algae as well. And then larger things feed on them and so on. There are also a number of parasitic copepods around the world, and reportedly there are some parasitic copepods on fish in the Yellowstone ecosystem as well. But they're an important part of aquatic and marine food chains. Another group would be the brachiopods. The brachiopods, the name is trying to tell us that they're gill-footed, and so the water flea would be an example here. And again, this is just another small crustacean that we find in food chains, mainly feeding on aquatic algae. And then larger animals will feed on them, larger animals on them, so fairly low in the food chain. And then there's some members of the class Malacostraca. And here the order Decapoda is probably the most significant. And an example of a decapod in the ecosystem would be crayfish. And so crayfish, I actually have not seen, but we generally find them in streams. I haven't seen them in the park. They're probably more around the periphery of the park. And so again, this is an example of a crayfish. And so again, they have chelicerae for grasping. We'll see the 4 pairs of walking legs, cephalothorax, and abdomen here. And then that brings us to our last subphylum, which even among the arthropods is by far the largest group, and these are the Euramnians, which includes the insects. And so the Uniramians get their name from the fact that they have uniramous appendages. And so instead of branching appendages that we see in the crustaceans, they have appendages of a single branch. And they will have one pair of antennae as well. So that's for the subphylum. Now, as we look at classes within the Uniramia, here the major class are the insects. And again, as we look at arthropods, as we look at Uniramians, insects are the largest group. So there are, almost 1 million identified species of insects. We estimate that there might be 2 or 3 million species of insects in the world. So again, an ancient group, a very successful group, and they make up a significant amount of the biomass and species in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So we certainly can't talk about all the different species. So here we'll talk about some of the orders that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and some are quite significant. So as we look at the insecta then, characteristics of the insecta is that we'll see 3 body regions. So they'll have a head, they have a thorax or chest region, and they will have an abdomen. As I mentioned already, they have one pair of antennae, and then 3 pairs of walking legs. So those are characteristics of the group. Another thing I'll mention about them, because it is kind of significant, for example, with the grasshopper that we're looking at here, is that they do have openings into the interior of the body that are known as spiracles. And so that's how they get oxygen into the interior of the body. And as they move around, air will move in and out of these spiracles. And so the spiracles actually are a point of vulnerability for insects and control of insect populations. Many of them are parasitized by the mites that we talked about previously, and also they can get fungal infections that attack them through the spiracles as well. And so again, what can happen is that small mites and also fungi can clog up those spiracles, and then they can't respire gases, and they suffocate. So again, this is one of the things, for example, with grasshoppers in that ecosystem that's really important. In wet years, you'll actually have fungi that grow into the spiracles and kill a lot of grasshoppers. So when you look at grasshopper populations in the ecosystem, it's usually the opposite of what you think. Generally, you think wet years, lots of vegetation, that means, lots, you might think that that's going to mean lots of insects. In particular, lots of grasshoppers. But it's actually just the opposite of that, because in wet years, again, you'll get lots of fungal infestations, and so that actually keeps the grasshopper populations down. And it's in the dry years where the grasshopper populations explode. And that is something that, as we talk about management of the ecosystem, that's something that is significant that you have to consider. Because again, some of the years, you just can't believe how many grasshoppers are up there in the dry years, and they eat a lot of vegetation. So if you're managing the ecosystem and you're looking at the flow of energy in the ecosystem, if the grasses and other plants are being devastated by insects, that's less forage for your elk and your bison, and that will have a downstream effect, a so-called trophic cascade that comes out of that. So again, that will translate to potentially fewer elk young, fewer bison young, and so that will impact the predators as well. So these all go into the formulas in trying to calculate animal behavior based on the kind of year you're having in terms of climate. That will determine what kind of plants you're going to have, how much insect infestation, and then how that translates through the food chain. Now, another thing I want to mention about insects is that in categorizing insects, although we're not going to make too big of a deal of it in this class, but we generally see 2 types of metamorphosis. One is a complete metamorphosis. In complete metamorphosis, we start with an egg. The egg will produce a worm-like larva. It will go into a pupal state, in an active state, and then metamorphose into the adult state. So again, if there's an egg, followed by a worm-like larva, a pupa, and then finally the adult, we consider that a complete metamorphosis within the insects. The other side of that would be incomplete metamorphosis. And in incomplete metamorphosis, basically what hatches out of the egg is not a worm-like larva, but a larva that has appendages. Sometimes in these immature stages are known as nymphs or midges. And so they will go through a series of molts, and that's another characteristic of the arthropods. The arthropods do have this chitinous exoskeleton that must be shed when they grow. And so within the insects then, the nymphs will shed into a slightly different form, and so they kind of transition more slowly as they molt or shed from one stage to another. But again, the nymphal stage is this incomplete metamorphosis. We don't have those 4 distinct stages that we see in complete metamorphosis, and we have larval stages with appendages. All right, so I would like to start at least talking about a couple of insect orders, and then we'll continue in our next module. But one of the insect orders that's really significant, a major order, would be the Coleoptera. The Coleoptera are the beetles. And even among insects, which again is incredibly diverse and numerous, I would have to say the beetles are probably the most numerous of the insects in terms of species diversity and actually sheer numbers as well. So again, there's tremendous diversity of beetles within the ecosystem. One of the things that, and I'll show you a couple of examples of some beetles here, but one of the things that you want to look for when you're looking at beetles and trying to characterize them and distinguish them from some other types of insects is that they generally have a dome-like abdomen, and they'll have 2 pairs of wings. They have an outer pair of protective wings that are not used for flying. Those pivot up, and then they have membranous wings underneath that they will use for flying potentially. So beetles can sometimes be confused with another order we're going to talk about, which are the bugs. And again, one of the ways to distinguish is that the beetles will have a dome-like abdomen as opposed to a flat abdomen. So one of the real problems in the ecosystem is a beetle, the western pine beetle. Western pine beetle is devastating western forests. The western pine beetle is actually a very small beetle, but what it will do is if bark is damaged, the larvae, or eggs are laid in the sap, larvae move into the interior of the bark, the phloem layer, and they'll feed there and eventually pupate there as well. But the problem is that they feed on that phloem and cambium layers of the tree, and they'll eventually work their way around and consume all of the phloem. Then sugars cannot get to the roots of the plants, and so the roots of the plants will starve. And so the western pine beetle population really has exploded as conditions have gotten drier in the western United States. And this is showing you some of the tracks of the larvae of the beetles in the trunk of a tree. And this is wiping out large stands of pines throughout the ecosystem. The real concern is the white bark pine. The white bark pine is a major food source for grizzly bears. And we expect really all of the white bark pines to be dead within 10 years, and that is going to impact the grizzly population. I'll continue our discussion of insects next time.